Welcome back, everybody. This time we're going to be taking a look at the science of sex and gender. It's a hot topic these days. There's a lot of opinions flying around. We've got some research and some really pointed opinions from experts that we're going to be looking at. And to help us break it all down, we have an expert in biology and human development with us today.
It's great to be here.
So let's dive right in. One of the things that we hear a lot about these days is this idea that sex is assigned at birth. But our sources seem to be pushing back pretty hard against that term.
Yeah, absolutely. Assigned kind of implies that, like somebody's just making a decision, and that's not really what's happening. Sex is determined from the moment of conception. It's determined by your chromosomes XX or XY. What we're observing at birth is just a reflection of that biological blueprint that's already there.
So it's more accurate to say that sex is observed at birth rather than assigned.
Precisely. It's like saying, observing the color of a flower. You don't assign a rose its redness. You just observe the color that's already there.
That's a really good analogy. And our sources point to the role of specific genes in this process.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating research on this. For a long time, people thought that female development was kind of like the default pathway, and that male development, required a specific set of genetic instructions to sort of kick in. But more recently, a researcher named May Pantier discovered a gene called FOXL2, and it's on the X chromosome. And this gene is absolutely essential for female development. So it really kind of turned that whole default sex idea on its head. And it showed that both male and female development are actively driven by these, specific genetic programs.
Okay, so we've got these two distinct biological pathways, male and female. But what about intersex individuals? Where do they fit in all this? They seem to challenge this idea of a strict binary.
That's a good question. And intersex conditions are often kind of held up as evidence against, the binary system. But it's important to understand that these conditions are relatively rare, and they often involve, very specific genetic or hormonal variations. They don't actually invalidate the fundamental reality of male and female biological pathways.
So they're more like exceptions to the rule.
Exactly. Variations within the existing binary framework, not evidence for, a whole spectrum of sexes.
Okay, that makes sense.
You're in a conversation, and someone says, people can decide if they're a boy, girl, or non-binary because sex is just something assigned at birth. What would you say? First, a person's sex is acknowledged, not assigned. There are many things that doctors learn about a baby when it's born, like height, weight, and blood type. Those things aren't assigned, they're acknowledged. Other things are assigned at birth, like a name. Babies are assigned names exclusively on the preferences of their parents. So, if some things are acknowledged and other things are assigned, which category does a baby's sex fall into? Is it more like being given a name by parents, or is it more like learning the blood type from the doctor? This leads us to the second point. Sex is determined by our reproductive system. In most cases, humans are born with two sex chromosomes, either XX or XY. Those chromosomes lead to the creation of reproductive organs, which create sex hormones, which in turn create genitalia and secondary sex characteristics, like body hair, bone structure, or an Adam's apple. Within our species, there are only two reproductive systems, male and female. As Professor Abigail Favale writes in her book, The Genesis of Gender, a female is the kind of human being whose body is organized around the potential to gestate new life. A male, on the other hand, has a different reproductive system consisting of different chromosomes than females, reproductive organs, sex hormones, and genitalia. Third, disorders of sexual development don't create new categories of sex. The disorder that occurs when a person's reproductive system doesn't develop neatly along a male or female path is called intersex. If a person is intersex, that does not mean that he or she is not male or female. Nor does it mean that there are additional categories of sex than male and female. Some people are born without limbs, others are born blind. Disorders of sexual development are not evidence of a new category of sex any more than disorders of the cardiac or respiratory systems are evidence of new kinds of hearts or lungs. In fact, as Favale points out, in 99.98% of these cases, sex is readily recognizable as unambiguously male or female.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about gender. Some of our sources argue that the concept of gender is actually meaningless outside of, a grammatical context. So how does that work?
Well, the term gender, when it's separated from biological sex, it gets really slippery. It's often used to describe social roles, behaviors, identities. But without a clear biological anchor, it becomes incredibly subjective and fluid.
In fact, one of our sources told this really funny story about a French professor who insists that gender is purely grammatical term.
Right, and in a lot of languages, nouns have grammatical genders. That's all the term means. It's not a reflection of a person's identity or feelings.
So are you saying then that there's no such thing as a gender spectrum?
From a scientific perspective, the idea of a gender spectrum doesn't really have any clear basis. You've got biological males and you've got biological females. And while individuals might express their masculinity or femininity in different ways, those expressions don't change their underlying biological sex.
Interesting. So our sources also talk about transgenderism, particularly in Western societies. And they seem to suggest that it's largely driven by social factors. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, the sources we're looking at, they're presenting this argument that the rise of transgenderism in the West is really tied to social pressures, the influence of media, and even, what's being taught in schools. They argue that these factors are creating this environment where individuals, particularly young people, are being encouraged to question their biological sex and to explore these, alternative gender identities.
So they're saying that some people might be influenced to identify as transgender, even if they aren't.
Yeah, that's the argument they're making. One source even compares it to a blind person wanting to fly a plane. They're saying just because you feel something very strongly doesn't mean that it's inherently possible or safe. They also draw parallels to other historical situations where individuals might have wished to belong to a non-discriminated group, even if it meant kind of denying their fundamental identity.
Wow, those are some pretty thought-provoking comparisons. And of course, it's important for us to remember that we're here to explore these ideas, not to endorse them.
Absolutely. Our goal is just to understand the different viewpoints that are out there and to critically examine the evidence.
Okay, so we've talked about the binary nature of sex, the idea of a gender spectrum. But what I find really fascinating is this discussion about endocrine disruptors. These are chemicals that can actually mess with our hormones, right?
Right. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that can mimic or they can block the action of hormones in our bodies. And, we were talking about how hormones play this crucial role in shaping sexual development. Well, endocrine disruptors can really mess with that process, sometimes with pretty significant consequences.
So these are things in our environment that can actually have an impact on our biology.
Precisely.
And that's where I think things start to get really interesting and maybe a little bit concerning. So what are some examples of these endocrine disruptors and how are they actually affecting us?
Well, one really striking example that comes up in the material is this marine snail. That developed a penis because of exposure to certain chemicals. I know it sounds strange, but it really highlights how powerful these endocrine disruptors can be in terms of actually altering sexual development, even in animals.
Wow, that's quite an image. So are we talking about, similar things potentially happening in humans?
I mean, we haven't seen, humans developing like completely new sex characteristics or anything like that. But there is growing concern about the impact of these endocrine disruptors on human health, and particularly male fertility.
So how's that working?
Well, one of the sources talks about this research by a guy named Professor Robert at the Commissariat l'Énergie Atomique. And his team, they found that phthalates, which is a type of plasticizer commonly found in plastics, can actually reduce hormone levels in fetal testicles.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about chemicals in everyday products that could potentially be affecting a developing fetus.
Exactly. And that reduction in hormones, it can disrupt what we call the masculinization process, which is, that whole complex series of events that leads to, typical male development.
So what kinds of things are we talking about here? What are some other examples of endocrine disruptors that people might be coming into contact with in their daily lives?
Well, phthalates are just one example. You've also got things like BPA, pesticides, even certain medications. All of these things can interfere with hormones, and they're found in all sorts of products. Plastic containers, personal care products, cleaning supplies, even our food.
Gosh, so it sounds like we're practically surrounded by these hormone disruptors. So what can we do to protect ourselves and our families?
Well, there are things you can do. One simple change is to start choosing glass or stainless steel containers for food storage. instead of plastic.
Okay, so ditch the plastic Tupperware. Got it. What else?
Opting for natural cleaning products and personal care items can make a big difference too. A lot of conventional products are just loaded with these harmful chemicals. So look for things that are labeled phthalate-free, paraben-free, fragrance-free.
That makes sense.
What about food?
Eating organic as much as possible is really important, especially fruits and vegetables. Pesticides are a huge source of endocrine disruptors.
Right.
I know organic can be more expensive, but farmers markets can be a good way to find more affordable options. Yeah, those are all good tips. It sounds like making even small changes can really add up.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual health either. Some of these sources, they go so far as to say that widespread exposure to endocrine disruptors is actually contributing to a diminishment of humans as a species.
Diminishment. What do they mean by that?
Well, it's a pretty bold claim. But the idea is that these chemicals are basically weakening us, making us more susceptible to diseases less fertile. And that this could eventually lead to, decline in overall human health and well-being.
That's pretty alarming. Do they connect that to anything else?
Yeah, and this is where things get even more interesting. They connect this idea of human diminishment to the rise of transhumanism.
Transhumanism, I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I really understand what it means.
Basically, it's this movement that advocates for using technology to enhance human capabilities, even to the point of, merging humans with machines.
Oh, wow.
Some people believe that we can overcome our biological limitations and achieve kind of a superhuman state.
Okay, so how do endocrine disruptors fit into all of this?
Well, the argument is that as humans become weaker because of all these chemicals, we're going to be more likely to embrace these technological enhancements to make up for our perceived deficiencies.
That's a fascinating thought and kind of unsettling too. Like we're creating a problem and then turning to technology to try to fix it.
Right.
This is a lot to take in. I mean, we've gone from like the microscopic level of genes and hormones to these, big picture questions about technology and the future of humanity.
It all comes back to understanding the science. Our bodies are these incredibly complex systems, and we need to be aware of all these different factors, both internal and external, that can influence our health and development.
Right, and it seems like knowledge is power in this case. Understanding how endocrine disruptors work, it can help us make better choices about, our lifestyle or environment.
Absolutely. It also helps us participate in, more informed discussions about complex issues like sex, gender, even the future of humanity.
This has been a really incredible deep dive so far. I'm really curious to see what else these sources have to say about all this.
Well, there's still a lot to unpack. I mean, we haven't even touched on, the potential long-term societal impacts of endocrine disruption. The sources that we're looking at, they seem to present a very different perspective.
Yeah, they really challenge that whole notion of a gender spectrum. And they argue that it doesn't have a basis in science. Biological sex is a real thing. It's determined by our chromosomes. It's reflected in our anatomy and our physiology.
Sources that we're looking at today, they express concern that, this emphasis on social constructs and kind of a denial of biological realities could actually be harmful, especially for young people who are, trying to figure out who they are. They worry that it could lead to confusion and distress, particularly for people who are struggling with gender dysphoria.
So they're saying that this push for gender fluidity, while it might be well-intentioned, could actually end up doing more harm than good.
That's the argument that they're making. And they really emphasize the need for these, open and honest conversations that acknowledge both the science and the lived experiences of individuals, but without kind of losing sight of those biological foundations of sex and gender.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue for sure. But let's bring it back to something that maybe we have a little bit more control over. Those endocrine disruptors that we were talking about. What are some of the broader long-term societal impacts that these sources highlight?
Well, one of the things that some experts are pointing to is this rather unsettling parallel between endocrine disruptors and lead poisoning in ancient Rome.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy comparison. What's the connection there?
Well, lead was used everywhere in ancient Rome. Plumbing, pottery, winemaking. And over time, that chronic lead exposure is thought to have contributed to all sorts of health problems. And some people even believe that it played a role in the decline of the Roman Empire.
So are they saying that endocrine disruptors could have a similar kind of insidious effect on modern society?
Yeah, that's the concern. These chemicals are everywhere in our environment, and we're really just starting to understand their long-term effects.
Yeah.
Some researchers believe that endocrine disruptors could be contributing to declining fertility rates, an increase in developmental disorders, even a rise in certain types of cancers.
This is starting to sound like a public health crisis in the making. Is there anything we can do to prevent this kind of scenario from playing out?
The good news is that there's growing awareness about endocrine disruptors, and research is starting to shed more light on the dangers. And that knowledge gives us the power to do something about it. We can make informed choices about the products we use. We can advocate for stricter regulations. We can support research into safer alternatives.
So it's not all doom and gloom. We can actually turn things around.
Absolutely. We have the power to reduce the risks. But it takes understanding the science, being proactive, and working together to create a healthier environment.
Well, that's a message I think we can all get behind. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you'd like our listeners to think about?
Well, I think the most important message is that sex is a biological reality. It's not a social construct. It's rooted in our genes, and it has a profound influence on our development and our health. And while social and cultural factors definitely play a role in how we understand gender, we can't just ignore the science.
Right. And we also need to be mindful of the impact that these endocrine disruptors can have on our health. By making smart choices and advocating for change, we can protect ourselves and future generations from these harmful chemicals.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of really complex and controversial territory, but ultimately it's about empowering ourselves with knowledge so we can make good decisions and navigate this, this really complex landscape of sex, gender, and human health.
Well said. Huge thanks to you for guiding us through all of this really interesting and thought-provoking material. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, keep having those conversations. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.